January 14th, 1944. A thin layer of frost clung to the roofs of the wooden barracks, turning the quiet American Midwest into a pale expanse of silver and breathless cold. Dawn had not yet broken. Only a dim blue glow stretched across the horizon. The German prisoners inside the camp stirred slowly, wrapped in wool blankets that felt strangely heavier than the ones they had known in Europe. Outside, the world was still. No distant artillery, no rumbling trains carrying refugees, no sirens cutting through the morning, only silence. Broad, steady, almost unnatural for men who had lived years in the turbulence of a collapsing continent. The guards walked their early patrol with soft steps, boots pressing into the frozen ground without echo. A lantern flickered at the gate. Smoke curled gently from the kitchen chimney, drifting upward in a way that suggested peace rather than urgency. The Germans watched it silently, unsure whether to trust this tranquility. Some had expected harshness, others feared humiliation. Yet the camp remained calm, indifferent, and almost serene. And in that cold, expectant stillness, the prisoners noticed something. The silence was beginning to change, carried on the faintest pulse of distant American engines. The silence of that January morning made little sense to the German prisoners because their journey to this place had been anything but quiet. Most had been captured months earlier in North Africa, where the British and Americans had pushed the Afrika Korps into retreat. Others had been taken in Sicily, or during the sweeping Allied offensives that followed. After interrogation in the Mediterranean, they were placed aboard American transports and carried thousands of miles across the Atlantic, far from the bombed cities of Europe, far from the front lines, far from everything familiar. Their expectations had been shaped by the world they left behind. In Germany, propaganda insisted that the Americans were crude, vindictive, and chaotic, a mongrel nation whose culture lacked discipline and whose soldiers lived without honor. They were told the Americans would starve them, beat them, or work them to death. Many believed it. Some braced for it. But when they arrived, they found long stretches of farmland, wide roads without shell craters, and towns untouched by war. Their camps were built inland by design, placed in regions where escape was nearly impossible and where the landscape provided natural isolation, rolling plains, quiet forests, and miles of open distance. The barbed wire and guard towers were real, but the environment surrounding them was peaceful in a way the prisoners did not trust. The regulations followed inside the camps were guided by the Geneva Convention. Clothing was issued, medical care was provided. Rations were measured, steady, and, to the disbelief of many, often more plentiful than what German civilians were eating at home. There were libraries, workshops, and small parcels of farmland where the POWs could tend gardens. And always the same strange element: silence. No bombers overhead, no distant explosions, no panic, only a quiet landscape that seemed to exist outside the war. Yet this quiet was not the mark of a weak nation. It was the pause between movements, the waiting air before American industry made itself heard. To the Germans, the calm of the American interior felt unreal because it contrasted so sharply with the world they had come from. By 1944, much of Germany lived under the constant threat of Allied bombing. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen shuddered beneath nightly raids. Trains moved only under camouflage. Streets lay half-ruined. Civilians slept in shelters more often than their own homes. Silence no longer existed in the Reich. It had been driven out by the ceaseless rhythm of war. But the American Midwest, where many POW camps were built, knew no such disruption. The countryside remained intact, a wide stretch of fields and small towns untouched by the chaos consuming Europe. It was a region defined by open skies and long distances, where life continued with unhurried precision. Farmers tended to livestock. Families gathered in warm houses. Local factories worked through predictable shifts, producing goods that supplied an expanding military machine. To the prisoners, this unbroken order felt like a glimpse into a world they had been told did not exist. Reports kept by camp inspectors noted that many German POWs were surprised not by harshness, but by abundance. Meals included bread, vegetables, meat, and sometimes fruit, a level of consistency unimaginable back home after years of rationing. The camp infirmaries were stocked with supplies. Red Cross parcels arrived regularly. Even the coldest days retained a sense of stability. For the Germans, this steadiness held an unsettling implication. America could wage a global war and still maintain a home front that appeared untouched, disciplined, and overwhelmingly calm. It suggested a depth of resources that Germany could not match, a quietly growing strength concealed under the surface of rural stillness. But silence in America was never permanent. It was the product of distance, not weakness. And the prisoners would soon learn that behind this quiet lay something immense, a force revealed not through words or threats, but through the steady, rising hum of engines moving across the horizon.
And then there was the technological angle, the one that would leave the deepest impression. Germans who grew up in cities accustomed to the mechanical roar of factories expected American rural life to be technologically simple. Instead, they encountered a landscape alive with machines, tractors plowing frozen fields, trucks rolling in with deliveries, and, on some days, long formations of aircraft passing overhead. Even at a distance, the engines had a different tone, smoother, stronger, somehow fuller. Many POWs would later write that the first time they heard a convoy of American trucks approaching, they understood that the industrial scale behind those machines was beyond what Germany could reproduce. The sound carried not aggression, but certainty, the weight of a nation whose factories never slept. As days passed, the prisoners found themselves listening for those engines, learning to distinguish their rhythms and sensing that each vibration in the air pointed to a truth they had not yet admitted. If the first days in the American Midwest challenged German assumptions, the experiences that followed reshaped them entirely. Much of this emerged through the enemy POV angle, preserved in letters and memoirs written long after the war. German prisoners repeatedly described their astonishment at the sheer normalcy of American life. In their accounts, guards seemed unhurried, well-fed, and largely unconcerned with the burdens that weighed so heavily on people back home. Newspapers delivered to the camps carried stories of industry expansions, of new aircraft rolling off assembly lines, of shipyards launching vessels at unprecedented speed. For the Germans, these reports did not feel like propaganda. They matched the physical evidence all around them. The camp kitchen never ran out of flour. The infirmary never lacked medicine. Even the tools in the workshops were clean, modern, and plentiful. To men raised on rigid hierarchy and constant scarcity, such abundance was disorienting. This disorientation fed into the moral angle, where ideology confronted experience. Many prisoners had believed that strength came from hardness, from sacrifice, from a society wholly mobilized for war. Yet here was a country that fought on multiple fronts while maintaining a standard of living that felt almost luxurious by comparison. The moral contradiction was impossible to ignore. They were being treated according to international law, fed, clothed, and given opportunities to work, even as their own government had abandoned such principles long before. Interrogators rarely shouted, guards rarely provoked. Some POWs noticed that American officers addressed them formally, even respectfully, regardless of rank. These small interactions accumulated into something larger, the realization that their captors operated within a system that valued rules, stability, and a kind of fairness that did not exist under the regime they had sworn loyalty to. This understanding did not arise from lectures or pamphlets. It grew quietly, rooted in lived experience. Then came the symbolic angle, the one that tied everything together. The sound of American engines. Day after day, the prisoners noticed how often those engines appeared. Trucks bringing mail, tractors working the land beside the camp fence, long supply convoys on distant roads, transport aircraft rumbling overhead. The rhythm of these machines became a constant presence, breaking the morning silence with a mechanical certainty that no German factory could match in wartime. These engines were more than transportation. They were symbols of a nation powered by vast industrial energy, supported by a population whose daily life remained strong and stable. To many POWs, the sound itself came to represent democracy in motion, a system fueled by cooperation rather than coercion, abundance rather than deprivation. And as the weeks passed, that sound grew louder, more frequent, and more difficult to ignore. A steady reminder that the quiet around them was only the surface of something far more immense. The turning point arrived on a morning that began like any other, cold, muted, and wrapped in the familiar stillness of the American interior. It was February 5, 1944, a date recorded in camp logs as uneventful at first glance. The prisoners stood for roll call, their breath forming pale clouds as the sun lifted slowly above the frost. The air was as quiet as it had been since their arrival, the same quiet that made them uneasy, the quiet they interpreted as fragility. But shortly after sunrise, a subtle vibration moved through the frozen ground. It was faint at first, barely more than a tremor. The guards noticed it. The prisoners noticed it. A few men stepped closer to the fence, listening with the instinct of soldiers trained to identify danger by sound alone. The vibration deepened into a note, low, steady, unfamiliar in its purity. Soon it grew into a layered hum, not one engine, but many, not one vehicle, but a formation. The silence of the Midwest did not break suddenly. It thickened, as if holding its breath before acknowledging the truth. What approached was not a column of tanks, not a punitive force, not the threat they expected. It was something different and far more revealing. A supply convoy, dozens of American vehicles, was drawing nearer, and with every second, the engines grew louder. When the convoy finally emerged along the road leading toward the camp, the Germans stood in silence, watching through the wire as one vehicle after another came into view. The line seemed endless. Heavy trucks loaded with canvas-covered crates, smaller utility vehicles carrying equipment, and a pair of maintenance jeeps escorting the column. Their engines produced a synchronized roar, not harsh, not strained, but confident. The mechanical voice of a nation whose factories had reached full stride. The prisoners had seen supply lines before, but never like this. In North Africa, German convoys arrived thin, irregular, and often depleted by Allied air attacks. Here, each American vehicle appeared clean, fully fueled and meticulously maintained. None crawled forward reluctantly. None emitted the choking exhaust of overworked engines. Even the cadence of the convoy suggested abundance, deliberate, unhurried, and free of the desperation that marked German logistics in the final years of the war. When the trucks halted, guards moved to unload them. Crates of food, medical stock, winter clothing, tools, blankets, and fresh agricultural supplies were stacked neatly on the ground. The Germans watched as the camp staff checked manifests and issued distribution orders with calm efficiency. This, not punishment, not transfer, not threat, was the reason for the rising engines. A demonstration of capability, not hostility. And in that moment, many of the prisoners understood something they had never articulated. The silence of America had never been emptiness. It had been capacity, waiting to be revealed. In the days following the convoy's arrival, the atmosphere inside the camp shifted in ways that reports later described as measurable. The Germans had not witnessed a single act of intimidation, yet their understanding of the war and of the nation holding them had subtly changed. Camp officers noted in their weekly summaries that prisoner morale improved noticeably after the February delivery. Men who had once viewed the silence around them as a sign of vulnerability now interpreted it differently, as a vast, disciplined calm supported by a logistical structure Germany could not equal. Some prisoners wrote quietly in notebooks allowed under Geneva regulations. Their words reflected a growing recognition that the world beyond the wire operated on principles very different from those of the Reich. They described the engines not as weapons, but as reminders of an industrial machine capable of feeding millions and arming an army spread across continents. A few even admitted years later that the first time they heard a convoy of American trucks approaching, they understood that the industrial scale behind those machines was beyond what Germany could reproduce.
When the war ended in Europe, the process of repatriating the prisoners began, but it was slow. At its peak, the United States held over 371,000 German POWs in more than 500 camps across the country. On July 23, 1946, one of the last transports left New York, carrying around 1,385 prisoners home. Nuremberg, casus passus. Some men remained longer, those who were ill, those sentenced for crimes, even a few escapees who avoided capture for years. In post-war interviews and memoirs, many former POWs spoke of a surprising affection. Some returned to Germany with new ideas, while others longed to come back. A few eventually did. Estimates suggest that a small number of former POWs resettled in the United States, drawn by the memory of American calm, work opportunities, and the very same engines that had so startled them behind the wire. For the men who left, those convoy engines remained vivid in their memories, not as a weapon, but as a promise. And decades later, when they spoke of their time in America, they often returned to the same word: capacity. A nation capable of sustaining war while preserving a measure of peace, order, and dignity. In that frozen morning of January 1944, the German prisoners believed themselves isolated, severed from a world at war. The stillness around them seemed to mock their expectations of brutality and disorder. But when the engines came, low at first, then swelling into a measured roar, they did more than deliver supplies. They revealed a deeper truth. The quiet was not weakness, but the calm before a quiet power. Those engines symbolized something wider than freight or machinery. They embodied the very heart of American industrial democracy. Factories humming far from the front lines, roads unscarred by destruction, supply lines stretching across fields and skies. To the prisoners, the sound carried an ideology, not of conquest, but of capacity. A society capable of sustaining both war and generosity. The shock for many Germans was not just in the food, the blankets, or the care. It was in the realization that their captors could do more than punish them. They could provide. They could build.
they could sustain. Over time, that realization reshaped their understanding of power. It shattered the myth that war demanded only force. Instead, it suggested that strength could lie in abundance, in stability, in systems that carried the burdens of conflict without collapsing under them. The engine's hum became a memory, a recurring note in the stories they would tell for years afterward. It remained more than a sound. It remained a symbol of a nation that, amid war, preserved a capacity for humanity. In the quiet that followed, many former POWs carried a paradox. They had been prisoners, yet they had learned something profound about freedom. They saw a society that, in its heart, valued more than victory. It valued order, work, and dignity. And they understood that abundance, when backed by a steady machine, could be as formidable as any weapon. That lesson echoes now, decades later, reminding us that true power lies not in the roar of guns, but in the steady heartbeat of industry, in the hum of engines that build, sustain, and endure.